Right, I'll be reading a few poems in my translations from this extraordinary 5-volume work, the Greek Anthology. And I'll say first of all a word about that anthology. Anthology is, in Greek, a gathering of flowers. And the Greek Anthology, as it's known, is a marvellous salvage from the vast shipwreck of the ancient world. It's a collection of about 4,500 poems composed over more than 1,500 years by about 300 authors. A colossal continuity and variety from pre-classical times through Roman into Byzantine. Sappho is there at the outset in the mid-7th century. The anthology as we know it now grew out of successive garlands, the first one woven by Meleager in the 1st century BC. 3 more such composers can be named, and parts of their collections, together with parts of others whose composers are unknown, were, perhaps in the early 10th century, incorporated into and arranged in the 15 books now preserved in a single manuscript in the Palatine Library in Heidelberg. In the 14th century, that grand collection was meddled with by a monk called Maximus Planudes. He cast out poems which he found offensive, but added others which, without his interference, would have been lost on statues and works of art. The Loeb volumes published that extra bit, in the interference by this monk, as an appendix. All the original garlands are lost. The surviving 16 books are only a small portion of a superabundance of treasured Greek poetry at one time or another gathered in. It's characteristic in that respect of the tiny survival of Greek works altogether. We know that much more was composed by very great writers, male and female, and it's largely lost. We have a tiny proportion of it left. I got interested in ancient Greek altogether through my studies of the German poet Friedrich Hölderlin, who was a passionate reader of and advocate for and made great use of classical writing. He translated Sophocles, and he translated the immensely difficult lyric poet Pindar. And I needed to know what he was doing when he what his translations were like, because they are idiosyncratic in the extreme. So, better or worse, I taught myself Greek when we were in Greece in 1981, and could work things out, and I used cribs and all sorts of things that would just help me to get the sense of what the two languages, the German and the Greek, were doing together. Then I came across an event, and it was an event in the life of the German poet Bertolt Brecht. In exile from Hitler in Denmark, his son bought him a Greek anthology, just a small selection of poems like that, 1 volume, digest of the whole thing, in German, translated by a contemporary translator. And Brecht was very taken with them, because most of the poems in these collections are brief, they're succinct, and they are epigrammatic. That is to say, they can reduce a great deal into a very small compass. And Brecht understood that he could use these polemically, that form polemically, against Hitler, against fascism. And he had a whole phase which lasted really for the rest of his life, of 4-liners, of quatrains, pithy quatrains, imitating the form of the Greek anthology and also the succinctness. right at the end of the war, he published a thing that, when he was finally let by the East German authorities, he published a volume of photographs of pictures called the War Primer, Kriegsfibel. And these were things that he'd obsessively collected throughout his time in exile. Pictures, very telling pictures of the war in its progress, the ill that it did, the terrible harm that it did, and particularly portraits of the people who'd brought it about. He made a collage then of the picture, often taken from an American magazine or a Swedish magazine or a Finnish magazine, and underneath those photographs he wrote his own four-liners, which offer you a different slant on the picture itself. He used a form which is germane, is natural to both German and English, that is to say, rhyming quatrains, iambic, pentameters usually. The actual form used by the Greeks is the hexameter, pentameter, that is a longer line and a shorter line. The minimum is couplets, sometimes it's 2, sometimes it's 4, sometimes it's 6, sometimes it's 8. Just briefly, I'd like to say what I did with that, because I took much more license than Brecht did. I suppose the form I've used most is the quatrain, the rhyming quatrain, because it's you are trying to say as much as possible in a small compass, and the rhymes are a good way of punctuating that. But I also work syllabically sometimes, that is to say, I set myself a certain number of syllables that had to be adhered to rigorously, partly in imitation of the longer line and the shorter line of the ancient Greek. And I started doing that in 1980, 81, and I could say really I've been doing it ever since. And it was particularly, I think, in lockdown that I returned to it as a great solace and also an undertaking, because the Greek world knew all about plague, and it knew all about atrocities of one sort or another. And there has been, in fact it seems to me the truth, that particular plague that we were met with derived more or less directly from an abuse of animals in a wet market in China, it's said. But whether it's specifically that or not, there's absolutely no doubt that certain ways of farming and certain ways of collecting and killing and selling birds and animals is liable to produce more or less serious illness. And the Greeks were very well aware. In fact, they had a much more, I don't mean they behaved well all the time, absolutely they did not. They did things which are quite as atrocious as we are doing now. But there was some understanding that if you abuse nature, you will pay for it. That there's a limit to what nature will allow you to do without answering back. And it meant, in many ways, actually harming the goddesses, particularly, who were the minders of the natural world. Demeter, who brought the corn into fruition at the right time. Her daughter Persephone, who descends and comes back again, is a kind of person going into the dark and bringing the light back again in spring. And they had a very strong sense of sacred things in nature, particularly trees and water, small rivers, but particularly springs. And one of the things that strikes you again and again about Greece is just you get outside the terrible destruction of the coastline very often, but you climb up a bit and you're walking on marble paths, actually laid down in marble to be beautiful and to be effective as well. And periodically along them are springs, and at the spring you gratefully receive a drink of pure, clean, cold water, which you especially need. The organisation of these shortish poems in my anthology of them is not to be simply chronologically through the 5 editions at all like that. They are divided into things like the sepulchral ones. A whole volume is given over to sepulchral epigrams, which were either literally or then, as it were, artificially memorials written on tombs. Some of them were in fact incised on tombs. Others became something that people wrote without necessarily thinking of them as belonging or being carved into a tomb. So there are hundreds of sepulchral ones. The anthology as a whole is also exceedingly rich in erotic poetry and exceedingly rich in poems having to do with the welfare of nature and what you risk happening to you if you maltreat it. There's a lot about warfare as well. The Greeks were perpetually fighting among themselves and against the Persians and against other nationalities. And there were notions of laws of war, which one side might or might not observe. But again, if you don't bury the dead, when the Persians invaded Greece and fought at Salamis and at Marathon, the slaughter of the Persians, who didn't know really where they were and were fighting on boggy ground and didn't entirely realise it, the slaughter of the Persians was colossal. The Athenians lost 192 dead, and one of their helping allies lost something like 22 dead, and tombs were raised to those. The whole plain was covered with dead Persians. When that was definitely won, they obeyed the law. That is to say, they obeyed the sacred law of burying the dead, knowing full well that if it had been the other way round, the Persians would have done as they threatened. That is to say, they would have left the Greek dead lying on top to be eaten by dogs. And that was part of the end of the war, in their view, that you finished people off by. The Greeks they detailed parties of soldiers that volunteered to do it, and they were sent out, and they buried the Persian dead. So there are things you do and things you're not supposed to do, and sometimes you do them anyway, and then there's a strong sense of punishment being possible. There are hundreds and hundreds, and understandably, of poems in the Greek Anthology which have to do with the sea. Much of Greek life was spent on the water, from island to island, trading or going for a marriage or visiting or in warfare. And it's in the nature of the Aegean, which is an enclosed sea as part of the Mediterranean, not like the Atlantic itself, but liable to very, very sudden fluctuations in weather, sudden, quite strong squalls. And although their boats were well made, they knew full well that if you put yourself at risk like that, then you would very likely drown. And Greek shipping, on the whole, kept as close as it could to the shoreline, and, as it were, so to speak, made a dash for it from one island to the next across open water. They knew you shouldn't really be long in open water, and there was a sailing season, and it ceased, and then you began again in the spring. Nevertheless, there are countless poems, really. I mean, this is a small selection of the number that would have been composed, about sailors, and not just sailors, but a man going to be married, or a woman going to be married, or people visiting the sick, their own sick, on another island, of the boat going down, the bodies being washed up. And then it was a duty, and this still obtains, actually, this obtains nowadays. There was a Victorian law passed which said that if bodies wash up on your shore, you are under an obligation to bury them decently. And that harks back to the Greeks, who felt it to be a religious obligation to bury the dead and not just leave them as it were, fodder for crabs and all the rest of it. So there's a great deal of poetry about, well, the pleasures of sailing, obviously, and the need for it, and the trade and the good it does connecting people, but also of the terrible peril that there is in it. Various gods and goddesses were appealed to before you set sail to watch over you. The Dioscuri, the twins, were favourites. When the Argo set sail, the Dioscuri, the twins, the sacred one, the sacred pair, caused a halo to appear on two of the masts, and the boat sailed, the Argo sailed with this kind of protective aureole around the masts. Cypris, Aphrodite, was appealed to also, and others, and temples were built, small temples or small shrines, as close as possible to the seashore, so you'd be in immediate touch with the water, the danger of it, and the need that you had to get safely across it. So there's lots of sepulchral ones, but also for the drowned, but also a great number of poems where sailors who've come back safely to their families make offerings at a shrine on the shore in thanks to the gods and goddesses looking over it. The poem here I'll read has to do with that proximity of these holy places built by the islanders themselves as a place where you would go and be. It's by a poet about whom I know nothing, Mnasalkas. It's often the way like that the only certain of the many poets in here, they crop up only in these anthologies. Some are absolutely very famous, and as I mentioned, Sappho as well, and Meleager, and Simonides, and lots of others. 3 or 4 women poets, but for the anthology, women poets would almost have not be present even now to be read. When let, they will go again and watch till the falling tide allows them to paddle down that long, low spit of land as far as the sanctuary of Cypris of the sea, and halt like children there in silence, hand in hand, and watch the kingfishers flitting to the lip of her well, whose waters through the salt rise sweet and plentiful in the shadow of the whispering black poplar tree. So they will watch the quick birds drink in the time allowed. Not very long ago, there was this absolutely catastrophic and made worse earthquake in Turkey and Syria, made worse by authorities who'd neglected their duty. There are a lot of poems about earthquakes and the destruction that those bring in Greek times, and there are a lot in this anthology. This is a true sort of quatrain, rhyming very purely, by a poet called Nicomachos. This was our city, beyond belief, but true. The sky fell on it, and it fell on us. Left among the living then were very few. Over the very many lay this tumulus. The arrangement in the anthology that I'm making for myself and that Neil is going to publish is, as I've said, not going to be, as it were, strictly in any kind of order. What I was really hoping for was some sort of constellation feeling, that different kinds of poems would be would be grouped, and you would see kind of resonances between those different sorts. There are quite a lot of poems spoken, as it were, by the horse himself or herself, who for the period of their youth were racing horses and won medals and prizes for their owners. And they were not all then well treated when their racing days had come to an end. And I've done translations of 4 or 5 of them in which the horse speaks, and the horse is still alive but has been put to turning a tread. Another thing you'll find on Greek islands still there are the threshing floors. They're circular. Some of them are very beautiful. They're made of marble. They would have a post in the middle, and the cereal kneading, threshing, would be flung down there, and a horse would turn on a spit like that, making sure that it got threshed in the machinery that's at the centre of it. And the racehorses, obviously, if they could speak, would find this very demeaning. What I've found here and translated with great pleasure and sympathy is not about a horse, but about an ox. I was speaking earlier to Neil about old diaries, notebooks I've got of Helen and I, our journeys, my journeys through Greece with the children from quite early on. And one place that Helen and I did go to was an island in the Aegean, which would soon become very infamous. And when we were there, we were actually shown by somebody just quite idly. He pointed down a cliff place and said, "That's where the donkeys end up. When they're no longer needed, we shove them over there and they feed a bit and then they die." And against that sort of attitude, I've translated this one here by a poet called Adius of Macedon. When his labouring ox was worn out by old age and the furrows, Alcon, reverencing him for his service, led him not to the slaughter, but to a meadow of deep grass. There, how this fellow creature, when Alcon strolls out to visit him at the hour of shadows, in grateful delight lifts up his head and bellows. I said earlier that the erotic strain throughout the anthology is very, very present. Heterosexual and homosexual love, and these early ones, early editions of these things, they print the Greek and then they won't translate it. They just put it into Latin so that only Latin scholars can really, actually, as it were, through knowing Greek as well, be told what it's all about. But here's an anonymous one, spoken by a woman. It's interesting and very gratifying, I think, that many of the poems are in the voices of young women, girls and women. There seems to have been in erotic play, at least, some sort of equality of pleasure. That night, all night, how busy we were. I was learning to play his body and he mine. So we gave and received till the rising of the morning star. Grateful, we hang this lyre in Cypris' shrine. That's Cypris there as the goddess of love. This is a poem, another anonymous one, actually. Many of them are anonymous. People made their livings on the sea. They also made a living of sorts out of more or less good land. They tilled it, they planted it, and they got produce from it. They were great beekeepers, some of them, and they had their hives. And this poem I wrote kind of in memory of my father-in-law, whose books are up there on the wall, who was of all things a Cornishman through and through, and detested leaving Cornwall. And when the family went on holiday, he would determinedly stay home and look after the garden. He was a very great gardener. He loved gardening, and he did wonderful things with the garden at Trewenick in Marazion. The gardener here is called Aminticus, but he reminded me of my father-in-law. Mother Earth, remembering how he laboured for you, take the old man Aminticus into your lap. He planted many ever-leafing olives in you, and with the vines of Bacchus made you splendid. For your thirst and for the music, he channeled clear water over you. He raised your oats and barley, pot herbs, the figs, the apples, the luscious peaches, so that you would look your best under the sun and the heavens would pause over you in delighted contemplation. So for his skills and courtesies, beloved earth, lie now gently on him, who never stamped or marched on you, never burdened you with sloth, nor disfigured you for lucre, but loved the curving line and honoured the contours. Cover this local man sweetly, and wreath in spring his grey head with your flowers. This is another one I'm particularly fond of, actually, because we read a lot about kings and queens and important nobility in the tragedies, obviously. But one thing that these poems in the anthology very readily do, and in fact mostly, is concentrate on not just ordinary people, but in many ways desperately poor people striving to keep alive and make a living. And obviously one way of making a living on an island is to fish. Perilous in itself, and there were fishing seasons as there were sailing seasons altogether when you would go and trade. This is a poem by Adeus of Mytilene, and the title of it is Diotimus the Fisherman. In the boat he fished from, getting a poor livelihood, at sunset, beaching, he housed in its stink and tackle. And when his time was up, and he sank into the sleep from which there is no awakening, in that same boat he rowed himself across to the dwellings of Hades. The dead stood and watched him approaching with steady strokes in a vessel of fire. The penniless fisherman, who had done small harm to the lovely face of the earth, pulled in the rhythm of a lifetime to the far shore and lit black Acheron with a wake of dancing flames. So he makes a pyre out of his own boat. This by a poet Antipater of Sidon, and his dates are now in the second half of the 2nd century BC. And this is another of those. They never stop being topical, these. We go to the Isles of Scilly whenever we can, and I think the first time I ever went, Helen had been many times before that, the Fastnet race was on. It will be let me get this right, roughly 1969, 69 I think, 70 possibly, and it was wrecked. The whole race was wrecked by a terrific and sudden storm, and the drowned floated in eventually on the islands of Scilly, the separate islands, the uninhabited islands as well. And Helen's cousin is still, he was a coast guard. He's still alive and still tending the fields, not going out in the boat so much now. But he was a coast guard, and his job as a coast guard, all the coast guards on all the islands had the job of at least once a day walking round the island and the off islands as well, the small islands that were in their vicinity, looking for the drowned. I went with him actually once and we found nobody, I'm quite glad to say, but he went again soon after that on his own, and he did indeed bring somebody in who'd been drowned in this desperately unhappy race. Something like 13 washed in on Scilly altogether. There are wrecks all the way along the coast of Cornwall. There's a very heroic statue at Newlyn which shows a seaman with his rope about to throw it out to sea so that somebody there would have the possibility of being hauled in on it. All fishing villages have losses, often very grievous losses, and people write about them and remember them. This is a poem I'm particularly fond of. A shrine has been put up here to the Lady of the Shore, which will probably again be Cypris, because Cypris loves the sea, Aphrodite loves the sea, but is also the guardian in a sense, or the person you appeal to, the goddess you appeal to for looking after the sailors. It would be the men who went out, and it would be the women who congregated on the shoreline to see them in. Helen and I had our honeymoon on the Isle of Arran, where on the Isles of Arran, Arran Islands, where exactly the same sort of thing was still operative, really. People going out in the currachs, fishing and coming in, and people being there on the shore to bring them back. So this poem from the second half of the 2nd century BC. Knowing your likings, we have enthroned you here, in a simple house on a bar of sand, near as we dare to the breakers, in the very din of them. For this, goddess of the wide and fickle sea, watch over us. Bid the winds remember how easily we drown. Fetch us home from the grey blue waters safe and sound, with our scant livings. Lady of the Shore, hearten the wives, the mothers, the widows, watching us in. This is a poem about what I mentioned earlier when we started about things you must not do, and one of the things you must not do is soil a spring. This was the spring above all others around here, the nymphs loved and praised. She ran cold and pure, sweet on the parched throat, ever abundant, clear, till a man came and washed his soiled hands in her, and she shrank back into the dark. The nymphs too went elsewhere. The road in horror makes a detour. Only the very thirsty, hoping against hope, like you, traveller, still come and kneel for what's not there. And here's another love poem, Asclepiades of Samos, about 270 BC. Sweet in summer to the thirsty is a draught of snow, and sweet to sailors after winter gales are the zephyrs of spring. But when they share their bodies' gifts and honour Cypris doing so, two lovers under one cloak are the sweetest thing. And two now I'd like to read, just quatrains by Anite. Anite, one of the few surviving, there were many, and the few works of the few have survived, of Tegea. This is one of our countless epigrams written on the deaths of women in childbirth. Particularly, it was perilous, and they prayed beforehand that they would come through, and people grieved afterwards if they didn't. And this short poem bewails the loss of a child, a girl, who was not married. Beloved and unwedded child of mine, leaving me childless, so we shall remain. I visit a likeness of you made of stone, and speak what cannot be and might have been. And another one by her now, celebrating precisely the cold spring that had been polluted by a man washing his hands, presumably after a murder there. So again by Anite of Tegea. Midsummer in the leaves there's a murmuring breath of air. Among the roots a cold spring bubbles through. Wayfarer, weary to death, here is kindness to spare. Earthly, heavenly, as the tree lives, so may you. Just a couple more. This is a poem by Timnes about whom I know nothing, and the title of it is On an Unknown Bird Called Elaeus. Elaeus. Elaeus is very close to the ancient Greek word for pity, and it was various speculations about what seabird particularly it might have been. But the loss of her, the absence of this bird from where she had previously been seen is felt to be a very grievous thing. And this did seem to me to be a poem that, from all that long time ago, is rather addressing us now in the increasing violation of the elements and our own self-deprivation, really, in them. He writes of the loss of a bird called Elaeus. The Graces nurtured her, and like the halcyon singing, she made a calm around her in the sea. She had sweet breath. She loved the light of the sun. He mourns the departure of a gentleness that we can't even put a name to, and no one supposes she would have tarried long with us. And lastly, this is somewhat like the poem I read earlier about the fisherman using his boat to get himself to Hades. This is actually a ferryman going between the mainland and Thasos, an island just below the mainland, heading over to the border. Born and bred on the shores of Thasos, forever ferrying folk to and fro between island and mainland, sure ploughman of the sea, if he dozed at the tiller, still his boat held her course. She's friends with the wind, trust her, he said, trust me. Towards the end, old beyond reckoning, he had the look of something barnacled, stuck fast on a wreck, and wouldn't be parted. Her and me, he said, me and her. Upturn her over me and light her for my pyre. So they sailed to Hades together, faithful pair.